now that FromSoft has knelt to Nintendo, they've gotten on their knees and begged to support the winning console platform after their minor success with Elden Ring. After, escaping from Bandai Namco and like distancing themselves from the evil PlayStation, From Software has come to the market leader, Nintendo, for help and guidance on how to make games other than the duck and roll simulators. That is the Souls franchise. Please, Nintendo, show us how to be creative. Show us how to make something with colors other than gray and black. Please tell us, how do you make a good fantasy game? They're going to their betters to improve what they do. And Nintendo is just like, well, okay, you're not a particularly good, important partner, but we'll work on something with you anyway. You can make your next game exclusive to Nintendo Switch. So FromSoft puts together this boring derivative looking online multiplayer game, which is very similar in concept to Night Rain, by the way, which I also should and so they do a Nintendo Direct, expecting people to lavish all this love and worship it, and nobody cared. The instant that people saw the Nintendo logo on a FromSoft trailer, they just turned around and just walked out, right? Just gone. Because when you get right down to it, the only reason that FromSoft was put on the pedestal it was because of the narrative that it was something better than what Nintendo was doing. Right? It was better than Zelda. It was better than Mario. It was better than Metroid. Nintendo wishes it could make a game as good as Dark Souls, a game where you can just run past 90% of the enemies in the game. It was a joke, right? It was a joke back then when Dark Souls came out, but because of this game's reputation, it has a lot of secondaries who don't play a lot of games, who don't know anything about the action RPG genre, who don't know anything about the better alternatives that exist, right? It's just that it was this really embarrassing thing. Seeing people try and act as if Elden Ring was in any way culturally significant, right? When you compare it to something better, like Breath of the Wild, which, not only sold more, but innovated more, had better visuals, better mechanics, a bigger open world, more things to do, and got a sequel, that did almost as well. And both of those games are going to continue to sell and just reach new audiences on Nintendo Switch too. Right, I think people are really underestimating the fact that, in the modern era, games like Breath of the Wild, games like Tears of the Kingdom are going to stay very, very relevant because of the existence of digital distribution, right? These games are not going to stop selling, at full price. That's definitely something a lot of people don't acknowledge, by the way, is that Tears of the Kingdom was at a higher price point than Elden Ring, and so actually made more money, without even accounting for the rest of the Zelda IP and stuff like that. Elden Ring was just a fad, okay? It was just a completely shallow, boring, just rehash of the original Dark Souls with the same exact content only with different terminology, right? You're not you're not undead, you're tarnished. You're not cursed, you're grafted. It's what is this cringy bullshit, right? It's so unoriginal and derivative and just kind of a rehash of what we've gotten before, right? There's been no growth in the past decade of these games. And so From, in their desperation to kind of expand past this old and tired formula, have desperately tried to put out other games. Armored Core 6, which flopped. Night Rain, which flopped. And now Night Rain 2, Duskbloods, only this time it's on Nintendo Switch. It's kind of cool. It's kind of interesting seeing like the response to this because like the narrative right now is that like the community is hoping that this isn't actually an exclusive. They're hoping it's timed. They're hoping it's going to come to like real gaming platforms sometime after launch. But like, I think it's very safe to say at this point that like this is a Nintendo game. This is something that will stay on Switch 2. There will be a FromSoftware game, the first major game made after Elden Ring, and it is a Nintendo exclusive. And people are seething about it. They don't like the fact that FromSoftware is putting out a game on Nintendo hardware. And I think because of that, because of like how poorly received Night Rain was and how like people really hate like the idea of Duskbloods in general and the Nintendo exclusivity, like I think this is going to be a repeat of the Bayonetta 2 and 3 situation, in which the community, in their desperation to continue to pretend as if Nintendo is a lesser brand, will like instantly declare that Duskbloods isn't very good, regardless of the actual quality, right? Like I think what's going to happen is regardless of how well this game does or how much critics like it or how much it like, how much From does with it or whatever, like the general overwhelming consensus among the community is that it's going to be a lesser game just because it's a Nintendo exclusive. And this, I think, is really going to like diminish the reputation of FromSoftware games in the normie sphere. Because like here you have the Nintendo Switch 2, which is the market leader. It's going to be a huge success story. Everybody's going to want one. Like everyone's going to be playing games other than Duskbloods, right? You have all these better games than Duskbloods out there. And then like it's going to get buried by normies, right? And then when you if you have so many people like spurging out about Duskblood, about how it's not as good as Elden Ring and how FromSoftware has like betrayed them or whatever, like if they keep spurging out about that, people are going to start thinking perhaps that FromSoftware is in the process of falling off. Remember, this is what happened with Platinum 2, right? Where like people began to worship them because of like Bayonetta and Metal Gear Rising. And then the company immediately came out and put out a couple of Nintendo exclusives. And that's what tanked their reputation. Because so many people in the space absolutely despise Nintendo and want to see them fail no matter what, right? Like, that is what you're going to see with Duskbloods, is that there's going to be a huge conflict between people who desperately want to prop up, like, everything FromSoftware does as this like untouchable masterpiece thing versus people who are like observing the reality of the situation and realizing that like Duskbloods is just not that great, like all FromSoftware games, and that like we really need to like start talking about how this studio needs to grow and evolve past the old and tired Souls formula, right? Like, again, it's going to be really interesting seeing this because I think this very well may be the first time that real criticisms of a FromSoftware title become mainstream instead of just me, like, sitting here, like, talking about how, repetitive and boring Elden Ring is. Like, if Night Rain, if Duskbloods is not well received, that's going to be tied into Night Rain, and if both of those games failed, there's this very real possibility that like, if FromSoftware puts out an Elden Ring 2, which is exactly like the first, but there's going to be this very real feeling of like, FromSoftware is not able to innovate or grow. Because all of their attempts at doing so have failed. And, it's gonna be really interesting seeing this. I think the Souls formula has been like propped up on such a pedestal and has been worshipped by so many people and has had so many imitators, a lot of which are actually better, actually. I think this franchise is going to have a lot of issues going forward. No, not the least of which, Elden Ring being ported to a real video game console, the Nintendo Switch. I think a lot of people are really going to start waking up to the fact that game is not very good. Like when you put that right next to Zelda on the same platform, like Elden Ring looks like boring, it's slow, it's repetitive, the bosses aren't interesting, right? Like Elden Ring is never ever going to compete with Zelda, and I think that's going to become more apparent with this re-release. And with all these other titles coming out in development, I think it's very possible we're going to see a large string of high-profile flops from FromSoft, right? Like Armored Core 6, Night Rain, and now this Nightblood. People will continue eating up FromSoft for the foreseeable future, just like they did with Square Enix back in the day. But I think it's safe to say that with this announcement, their days are numbered.